So to begin the afternoon, we've got Ben Cerveny, who I met a couple of years ago at a conference called Sketching with Hardware, which is kind of a strange conference. It was full of people from mainly software and interaction design industries. People like Arduino were there, and processing, Cycling 74, and Spark Fun, Adafruit. Perhaps for some people here, those aren't very commonly heard names, but for interaction designers, they're sort of like the kind of epicenter of a whole scene that's obviously emerging, and it's increasingly becoming connected to research in architecture. I think most architecture students now know what an Arduino is, but I can assure you a couple of years ago they didn't. So it's an amazing sort of transformation, I think, going on at a certain level, and we can see those tools being used even in the clusters here today. So when I met Ben at that conference, he was presenting his work with urban computing, but he's actually involved in a whole number of things. And when we were discussing which keynotes we'd have at this conference, we wanted to have perhaps an industrial designer or a technology consultant or a game designer or some CEO of some big software company or some data visualization artist. And we obviously only had a couple of places, and then Ben's name came up because he has actually been called all of those things and a few other things as well. And he's a very interesting guy, and I think we're going to have a great beginning to the afternoon with him. He's currently the design fellow at Samsung, working as a consultant for a number of companies, including Arab and Disney, and has been a CEO of a number of companies such as Bloom, was working at Stamen Design, was one of the founders of Flickr, and has worked at Frog Design, founder of the Experience Design Lab, as well as a whole number of other things, but I don't want to take up any more of his time, so I'll hand straight over to Ben. Thanks very much.
Hello, good afternoon. Somehow when I speak at conferences, I serendipitously always get scheduled right after lunch, which is quite good because I tend to speak in lyrical meditations about the domain and the discipline. So we're going to sort of take a step back into sort of a 10,000-foot view of where we're going in the relationship between software and the practice of architecture and the built environment. So just to start things off, I figured I'd maybe give a little warning, which is that a lot of the practices and tools you're mostly used to using are going through a pretty heavy transformation at the moment. Here I've characterized that as melting, which might be a little bit dramatic, but certainly what is happening is that what we used to think of as desktop computing and monolithic creative applications are beginning to be atomized. They're floating off into a variety of environments, namely tablet computers and immersive design systems where gesture and voice are used to activate creative processes. But what's really happening is that all of those functions that used to be 5 dialog boxes deep into a CAD application have now turned into things that run on servers far away that can be invoked through local interfaces and composed into applications. So a lot of, there are some tools that you'll probably still find familiar in these environments that we're going into. A lot of these, what we call data flow programming environments, like Grasshopper, or some of the tools you'll find. Almost all of the CAD applications have ways that you can program data flow. But what will be unique, I think, in the coming age of software utilization is that the components that you put into a data flow environment are going to come from a variety of sources in the cloud. So you'll have a composition environment where you can decide which modeling actions and transformations you want to apply to the thing that you're building, but all of those things will be running on a server far away and be brought to your mobile device or brought to a screen or a projection in your environment. So what does working in this type of environment entail? Well, a lot of times in my practice we call this type of utility following the user across all of their experiences soft working, because it's actually mostly based not on specific hardware contexts for how that work happens, but more of a flow of interactions that one can expect services to exist in all of the different places they might work, and they can invoke them with the familiarity with the actual service rather than the familiarity with the hardware context that that service is running in. So how do you get to those various actions and software tools that you might want to use? Well, that's where visualization comes in, the idea that you want to build ways of looking at catalogs of information. Usually, when you talk about visualization, you're talking usually about looking at data or content in some dynamic way that you can filter it and sort of begin to understand the relationships between it. But I would suggest that you can also visualize not just nouns, but verbs. So you can visualize tools and you can visualize functions when you're moving through. You might have there are ways, like when you use Google even, you're typing in a sentence into the search bar and there's an autocomplete that suggests all of the different things you might say at the end of that sentence. Well, that same type of grammar can be applied to transformational pipelines. So you can imagine that as you're working, you're laying out a data flow graph, and there might be ghost pathways that are informing you of other choices people have made in the same type of creative situation that you're in, and how you might actually begin to build that graph based on their knowledge. But what I would say is that another interesting modality that we're beginning to see in most software design that sort of comes from the world of game design in a way is this differentiation between composition and performance, which I think you specifically as a group within the larger group of architecture, I think probably are familiar with this idea in that there is usually a differentiation of roles between the tools designer and the creative operator of the tool. This happens a little bit more in CGI, I think, than in architecture. You find somebody who's called the technical director or the rigger who's building the tools, and then an animator who's using those tools within the affordances that the technical director has designed. So I think that, I think a variety of studios in architecture now have evolved groups that are the tools groups that are building out these, especially in this kind of procedural parametric environments, they're building out these kind of possibility spaces that designers actually operate inside of. And so you sort of have these various different modalities of engagement with the tool, some of which are browse modes in which you're sort of using visualization to bring the idea of function, closer to you and then into composition. But also you might be somebody who's more of a creative performer in the sense that you have someone else who's helping you with the tools design, and it's only in the moment of the creative act that you perform within that system. And then there's another set of interactions you might have with a procedural environment, particularly. A lot of times when you're running something like a genetic algorithm to determine a fitness function, or you're exploring a possibility space, you're exploring a variation system, around a set of parameters in a generative process. There's this idea that you're almost tending a flow, that there's something going on computationally elsewhere, maybe in the cloud, maybe on your local machine, but either way, it's something that it's not a one-to-one action response sort of stateful situation that you're in. Rather, you're steering something that's going to keep iterating, and you're sort of branching it and taking it in a direction one or another. But it's not your process that you've generated. It's something that you've set the initial conditions for and let unfold, and now are having a dynamic interaction with it. So this, I think the two metaphors that really tend to help people understand how the relationship with computation works in that situation is the tending of a flow, like a gardening process, or the tuning in of emergence. A lot of times you'll find also when you're dealing with a high variable data set, and then you're going to use a visualization technique to isolate some of those variables and start to look for patterns that occur in that data set. You're really it feels like, the old school, we're almost well past this as a metaphor, but the idea of tuning an analog radio where suddenly the static resolves into something that actually has stereo, it has structure as music. And then similarly, when you're moving through a data set and the relationships in a data set, a lot of times it looks like noise, and then suddenly chaos resolves into complexity, and you start to see relationships in the patterns. And that moment is where you start to understand that the data has information, and that information is meaningful. So one of the things about how we relate to these tools that we can build around tuning in complexity and around these feedback loops and tending, is that we're building essentially what we could think of as instruments. We're building ways of exploring possibility space that are constrained by rule spaces, constrained by rule sets that allow us to sort of navigate very specifically into, more creative pockets of possible results. And so, as we're steering these contraptions around, there is a virtuosity to our performative ability to intuit. This is where we sort of got into a discussion yesterday about intuition. And one of the things that, despite the idea that we might have very powerful feedback loops of genetic exploration or perhaps rules-based iteration going on the computer, we're still have this intuition to steer that process into more sort of fruitful results. We have a feedback loop about aesthetics and about the sort of solution space that we're targeting that we may not have actually encoded in the process that we're using, but we still understand what the sort of the optimization results are in that situation. The thing that's really interesting about that is that, as you build these instruments, you end up with people that have intuitive virtuosity with different types of instruments. So you begin to differentiate roles. Certain people might be better at dealing with structure. Other people are better at dealing with surface. Other people are better at dealing with flow and experience of occupation. And all of those become almost sort of the classes of user that you might have in a typical, sort of almost video gamey party of adventurers. There are multiple people involved in this sort of collaborative creative process of a total project, and those sort of can be divided out into these domains that don't really, per project you might actually have different quantizations because the total sort of complexity of the target result space has a whole bunch of different types of domains that can be factored out, and they're not, they don't go along traditional lines of, the types of things you might have in a business card. They're actually things that are emergent out of the type of complexity that you're pursuing. But I would say that, this picture I think is really great because the interesting thing about jazz, of course, is it is a real-time feedback, playful collaboration. The idea of play is something that underlies, I think, a lot of what's important about the type of software that you want to design for creative industry, because play is key in activating that type of intuitive choice making within the possibility space. So you need to be able to have the sort of empowerment to explore, how you can iteratively move through choices and be able to understand how other people's choices are affecting the sort of collaborative result set. And so that, when you design a playful system, that really, the rule space of that system often encodes this idea that everyone, is inside the circle of play and is making choices together that are, changing the field of results. So the thing, I was just talking about the idea that you have to be able to see everyone's sort of playful changes in the same context, and of course that, that result space is actually a model, is actually something that you want to be able to move through the design process. And this, I would suggest that we're at the very tip of the iceberg here, right? That people talk in this industry particularly about BIM, which is of course a way of modeling the semantic space of your design environment, and a way of talking about all of the machine processes and the people having a pivot point around which to operate. But what that doesn't account for is how much we've evolved our sort of understanding of what spatial information is and how we relate just as people, much less computer users or architects, to the idea of semantically encoded space. I would say that this issue, in a way, we sort of have to fractally zoom out, powers of 10 zoom out from the discourse around BIM and the discourse around architectural tools, and end up firmly situated in pop culture. Now, as citizens of cities in Europe and North America and Asia, we are already participants in an emergent system of spatial semantics, spatial computation, and understanding of space by machines and people that use everyday tasks to navigate, to understand space, to operate space. And I think this is really going to start to feed back into the discipline of architecture, urban planning, and design around space. So this graphic, by the way, is a classic project from Stamen. It's one of the first pieces that we worked on that was recognized by a museum. It's called Cab Spotting, and it's actually a map that was made of San Francisco with no map underneath. It was just GPS traces of all of the cabs in San Francisco that over time accreted and drew the map of the city. It was, I think, maybe almost 10 years ago now, which is crazy to think about. But this is the sort of thing that I think people, as we sort of gained this literacy in how we were going to begin to be able to understand space with computation, we started to realize that there was this new medium that was about the visualization of space and the understanding of space through the eyes of machines and databases that we hadn't really explored yet. And it was going to give us a whole new understanding of how we live together and a whole new understanding of how we could become together in space. So since that time of this very low resolution GPS map, we've moved on to, again, freely accessible public data sets like Nokia bought, I can't remember what the name of the company was that made these high resolution 3D models of cities that are kind of intensely high res. I mean, they really are. They're the surface mapping of the textures onto the buildings, and the models are very, very high resolution to the extent that you can actually imagine, architectural, I'm sure probably in your practices now you might even use some of these models, or at least SketchUp models, if not the Nokia models, in creating scenes in which you place potential new architecture just to understand the spatial considerations of what's going on with a new build. But the thing that's interesting about this is this is something you could imagine having used in your practice for a while, but in terms of an everyday user of a tablet device situated in a city, the idea that they can pull up a map that is either a street view surround photograph that they can actually navigate within to understand their relationship to the actual world in kind of an AR way, but they can also bring up this CG model that may have more schematic information semantically embedded in a sort of a BIM-like way so that they can understand occupancy, they can understand some of the metadata that's associated with the building, they can understand potentially where vacancies are or where different flows of material and information are going in the city. So all of this is now, these are now things that are arriving into the kind of pop cultural media space where people are sort of beginning to expect that type of availability of information and kind of accessibility of a representation of their environment. So the idea that one used to always imagine you would look at the map and sort of begin to understand the city. Now people can imagine looking at the model. And I think that's the really important part, is that people are beginning to internalize this concept of a model of place. It's not just a map. It's not just a representation, but it's actually, well, it is a representation, but it is a real-time integrated representation of all of the sort of facets of the urban experience that they're situated in that they can interrogate, whether it's about finding a restaurant or calling a cab or understanding where their friends are. Like all of these things are written into the spatial model that they believe is always sort of there around them to interrogate and to act upon. So of course, this is always, technology is always moving the frontier, forward of how much it can perceive about, how much can it quantize. And that's also another really interesting issue is what does quantization imply about all of these models? Because obviously, I think someone mentioned before, when you talk about optimizations in design, optimizations are based on sort of an ideal quantization. They're based on an ideal state and also based on a quantization that measures the approach to that state. And both of those things are ultimately relativistic. So when you apply them, you imply things about the space that you're measuring and the space that you're actually going to design for. So, it's really interesting to see the types of tools that are being deployed to get these models into the digital space in an operational way. They're all making assumptions about what it is we want to know about the environment. But you begin to see now already we're entering an era where Microsoft, Samsung, Apple, everyone is talking about this idea of building gesture recognition systems, things that understand visual characteristics in the environment, things that can make real-time 3D models of interiors, and all of those, all of that sort of spatial understanding, again, begins to form sort of a layer on top of the built environment. It's now sort of this bubble of understanding that the computational environment has about the built environment, and that you'll see becomes a medium in and of itself. Another thing to consider, is that basically software is like an amoeba of functional provisioning. It just sort of creeps out across things. So far, it's really attacked mostly only products, this idea of the objects that you buy and use on a daily basis. Those have been claimed by software and inside the bubble of functionality that software can provide. This idea that all the devices in your home are now smart, the Internet of Things has embedded, computation in most consumer items, or will, it seems like in the near future. And as those things come online, they begin to participate again in that sort of semantic model of your life. The semantic model of participating in this kind of surround of kind of functionality and kind of the possibility of building applications around all of these things. What is it that we want to do with all of this? And I think that the answer to that question is sort of up to us as experienced designers. And that's another thing that I would say is that so if software has claimed products and has claimed the space of, the built objects, then the built environments, I think, are squarely in the sights of the industry in Silicon Valley, right? You hear the rhetoric all the time, and the smart city is almost like is being hammered into everyone's, kind of conferences and whatnot with a larceny. The number of people that show up talking about Intel or Cisco or Google or Apple, all of these companies now are, beginning to imagine what it means to connect mobile devices and connect user experience, whether it's through gesture or, interface, with functionality in the environment. So what does that mean? That means that, you'll be able to potentially provision and control services in all of the places that you spend time, namely the workplace and at home, but obviously in transit infrastructures and in public places and in potentially, venues that you go for entertainment. So, as the software industry imagines itself building frameworks for these places, the question is, how does the industry of the built environment come to meet that? Do the providers of these spaces, like structural engineering and architecture, sort of, wait to have these providers of service arrive at their doorstep with, servers that they're hoping they'll plug them in? Like we have a solution for you, say the people from the software industry, and without really understanding all of the constraints of, the build process that you guys have and the infrastructure, in terms of what the affordances actually are that would even be programmable in the space. How fluid is the layout? How much flexibility is there in the facade? What types of surfaces can be transformed? All of these things are of your design domain and of your vocabulary and of your sort of explorative understanding of what the possibilities are for many years already. But the software industry, I can tell you right now, is busy dreaming up its own set of possibilities for this. And so I feel like, one of the things that I'm sort of encouraging all of you to do is think about what if they show up saying, we would love to be able to start this relationship, although they have shown up, saying that they would love to start this relationship, about user control of environments. What are the tool sets that you would want from them, and how would they be deployed? So, there is definitely this sense that already, especially in the home, I think this year we're going to see a lot of products deployed that are going to take advantage of gesture and voice, that make people, again, change their frame of reference. We've already had one huge change of frame of reference in the last 10 years, which has been the evaporation of the desktop computer into mobile devices. People not even thinking about, when you ask someone who's 12 or less what they think of computing, they may not even use the word computing because it's actually something that they just find in their hand, in their phone. And that's actually been subsumed, this idea that computation is around them. It's potentially somewhat invisible because it's just summonable by pulling out a device or turning on a screen rather than sitting down at a bespoke, sort of station, which is about the act of computing. That has now passed, and we're in this kind of ambient computing phase. But the next phase of that is actually letting go of those devices and having computing be provisioned into the environment itself. And as that happens, that means that the context for computing are the things that you build. If it turns out that the next phase is going to be about having projections arrive on the wall of the workspace, or on the floor of the of the entertainment venue, or onto an arbitrary screen that didn't really know about you until you arrived, how is the experience of that managed? And a lot of that will have to do with the affordances of the built environment that those interactions are happening in. And so, just in the same way in this previous slide, I was talking about how, industrial design was sculpted. It used to be, when I worked at Frog Design and began there, when someone like Motorola would show up and say, we really want a new phone, the industrial designers at Frog would immediately start sketching enclosures. It's like, okay, here's something sexy, check out this curve. And it turns out that within 3 years, that whole practice was almost entirely gone because it didn't really matter what the curve looked like on the outside. It mattered what was happening on the other side of the screen because it was about the user's connection with the services that they were pulling out of the network. So as that begins to be the relationship that people have with environments, as they expect digital services provisioned in the environment, then the environment itself begins to be sculpted by the delivery of those services. So that's something that I think is really a consideration that bears a lot more investigation. I mean, I think that there are already some assumptions we have about how these provision services are going to work, but I don't think we really know yet, what forms will really receive them most successfully. So in the fact that all of these, spaces can be provisioned with software, we get to a really strange moment where it's possible that if this fluidity of services is actually, provisionable enough in spaces that people move through, it's possible that their cognitive models could adjust such that they felt that they were inhabiting those services rather than inhabiting those spaces, right? If you're someone who's moving from room to room, and the sort of visual surround that you're used to using in terms of, here's my ambient visualization of social network activity, here's my music, here's the lighting instructions, here's the temperature instructions, and as I'm moving from room to room or venue to venue, all of those things are flowing onto screens and, actuated environmental controls, then potentially the relationship between, there's sort of a negative space relationship between software and environment. The augmented reality becomes something that's not necessarily, a little tiny thing that's happening in Google Glass that's projecting information over your environment, but instead it's something that's welling up in the cracks between all of the things that you're using in the actual environment. So the environment itself is transformed by the affordances of the software. And if that's the case, then there's this possibility. I mean, this is something obviously I think particularly huge entertainment brands in the US like Disney or like the studios would love to begin exploring this idea that you could bring someone into an inhabitable branded environment. This is kind of like the end game, I think, for a lot of these companies, is the idea that you could just become such a fan person that you just actually are a resident in their experience. And that's, I think, a lot of architectural commissions, I think, probably show up and make the similar demands of studios for the built environment. But now, with this layer of potential transformation by software that lives on top of the built environment, there could really be a very sort of encapsulating cognitive model that people might end up inhabiting. So, it's interesting to also imagine what the level of, sort of totalization of these tools would be, in the sense of, I don't think anyone really believes that. There are a lot of programs right now that are talking about using the city as a platform. The idea that, one of the things that a lot of people are concerned about is the nature of the proprietariness of the software. Obviously, if some specific individual vendor were to become, sort of the Microsoft Windows of spatial programming, that's an incredible lock-in. I mean, we talk about lock-in in kind of a metaphoric sense now, but if you're the software in control of actually provisioning how security works in the building, lock-in is no longer a metaphor. So the idea that urban systems potentially would be publicly controlled, I think, is something that people are really interested in exploring. The idea that open source and publicly available software are things that, if we are going to begin to affect the environment with this kind of provisioning control, we need to make sure that the politics of that is not something of exclusion and is not something of, hierarchical top-down manipulation. So how does something well upward? Well, it turns out we actually have a pretty good example for how something wells upward, and that's the internet itself. The way that we are currently envisioning, how these systems come together may actually just be totally flipped over by a sudden emergence of processes that people can run on a local scale that allow them to begin networking their homes together, and then, homes to neighborhoods, buildings to buildings, in a peer structure that has the same type of adaptive syndication that something like the internet has. And that has turned out to be a very robust network architecture. And it also, happens to have a politics that is actually a little bit adaptable, such that people can imagine that they're going to be represented still and they're not left out. The other thing that happens, of course, when you have provisionable buildings is that somebody who doesn't have a token to do the provisioning, whether it's your phone or some RFID that you're carrying or even a voice signature, if you're not in possession of any of those things, then the flocking car doesn't come to pick you up, or the screen doesn't show you, the menu that you need to see when you come to the building, or the door just doesn't open at all. So those are all really, primary concerns when thinking about how, software and the built environment interact. And I think we're now, starting to see an ethics evolve and kind of a practice, within the software industry to think about how those things can be approached sensibly. And I feel like, there's definitely a moment where those choices will need to be made by clients of yours or municipalities or, operators of entertainment spaces, and we need to be ready to discuss why, choosing one topology over another it has implications politically. So I've been calling this kind of set of resources that come from the built environment and, sort of expose all of the potential functionality in an environment to a programming tool set, an environmental programming interface, or an EPI, which is kind of convenient from a philosophical standpoint because there are things like epiphenomenon, which are things that live on top of the physical reality, and that's exactly what we're talking about here in terms of the way that software would interact in terms of with the built environment. So what does an EPI, sort of an EPI programming environment look like? Well, as we've discussed, it's this kind of the idea is that you would be able to unify a bunch of services through protocols. And I think this is key, is that in a lot of situations, when people talk about building, BIM-like monolithic models to operate space, they talk about having one service. And I think the thing that's really key here is that what we're talking about maybe is instead a set of protocols that allow many services to interoperate and federate to represent a space. And I think that's probably the thing that, needs to be resolved sooner rather than later, is the understanding of who are the actors in the space in the domain of providing spatial operation programming, and how do they communicate with each other. So this is always a slide I have to include just because a lot of people ask me, especially in the software world, people say, oh, this sounds a lot like a massively multiplayer online game like World of Warcraft. Are we all going to be suddenly, partied up and moving through the city, with all of this information overlaid on our sense of reality? And to a certain degree, it's true. I mean, if you look at something like a massively multiplayer online game and the tools that are made available to the players of that game that overlay their everyday experience of killing dragons, they're actually things that you can imagine operating in the real world as well. I mean, you have these displays of the real-time status of people that are in your group, the different verbs that are available to you in the space that you're in, some understanding of the context in a little mini-map and some possible ways of looking at different quest targets or routes that would take you to other different types of activity. So in terms of imagining what augmented reality in the built environment looks like, we actually have some pretty good models already that exist in gaming, because really the types of heads-up displays that you have in gaming are hinting at types of metadata and types of functionality that you'd want to be able to pull out of your relationship with the environment. But also on the back end, the thing that's really interesting, as Rory mentioned in the opening, Flickr grew out of a massively multiplayer online game called The Game Never Ending that was about collaborative creativity in social environments online. And the back end of that system was actually, had to be scalable in order to account for hundreds of people simultaneously occupying virtual spaces. Now, and those people also having relationship with virtual objects that had actions on them that other people could see in the room. And really, that's the same type of software infrastructure you'd need to overlay on top of an actual space, right? You need to be able to represent all the actors in the space and all of the objects in the space and all of the environmental conditions in the space as a state service. The idea that you understand all the characteristics and variability of all of those entities all at once, and then any verb that any actor uses makes a transformation on the object in the environment that's reflected to everyone else. That type of service is probably what we're going to see sort of growing. Right now, none of those things have been successfully applied to physical space yet. I mean, we have a lot of ways of sensing multiple actors in an environment or projecting at them. But I think I was showing you a slide back here of, this project, which was a Dubai project, so strangely enough was not realized, but was an amusement park for which a company that I was a partner in called AFK built a mesh computer system that was going to hang from the types of PA enclosures you have on the posts inside of an amusement park. It had Wi-Fi triangulation, RFID, projection, localized audio, and was able to create a mesh where you could basically have a spatial model of the park and therefore could mediate users as they move through. So here was a concept where you were going to project pet friends basically for all the visitors that would be showing up on various screens and project on the ground around them as they moved, and they would have information about what was going on in the park. And in those types of situations, let me go back to where I was here. Those are the types of situations that you can imagine, happening only when you have this type of real-time model that can, account for the state of everything in the space. So, really what I think a lot of, architecture is going to be transformed by this process, because I think what begins to happen here, especially for parametric designers like yourselves, is that you start to leave open the possibility space. Like the idea right now in the tools that you build is that you are building algorithmic environments for the exploration of design solutions for specific instances of buildings. But one of the things that happens when you have this type of digital flexibility that persists into the delivery of the building is that you might not have to close down all of that parametric variability, right? Like the idea is that you have set up a system of constraints that provides a possibility space. And rather than having designers at your firm say, this is the state of the building that we're going to deliver, instead you deliver something that's looser than that, which is this is the super state of the building that we're going to deliver. And these are the choices that the user can make inside of that superset to arrive at these variable configurations inside of that. And so the thing that's really interesting about that is that process is almost identical to game design, which is also the construction of a rule space that leaves the user capable of making choices that form the instance in the moment of performance. So the idea that open architecture is similar to game design, I think, is something that bears more investigation, because there are also parallel tool sets. And you'll find that a lot of times tool sets that are used in game design allow for more modeling of dynamic possibility that's really interesting to, I think people earlier were talking about using physics engines to arrive at form, or maybe using, AI actors to investigate, pathfinding and things like that in the space. But those tools don't have to be only in pre-visualization. Those tools can actually be in experience. Those tools can actually be left in the piece to be experienced by the inhabitant as they're there. So, I think it's really interesting to note that I think the specific skill set that this group brings to the table is already one that's in some ways pre-configured to understand the possibility space, pre-configured to understand how this is still an open medium. It's not something that's about collapsing sort of a hyperspace of all of the options that a building might present, but instead about deferring that collapse until the actual inhabitants, as collectively or singularly, can start making choices in their situation specific to them, potentially coming from real-time metadata that we have about them as designers, or coming from their own expression through voice or gesture or interaction with interfaces on touchscreens or mobile devices, and all of that sort of real-time interaction can generate transformation in the space. And so, I think that there's really kind of a new potential for a type of design here that lives somewhere between architecture and game design and visualization design, because of course there's also the issue of how to get people to understand. I mean, game design does not necessarily reach out to actual metadata and actual systemic information and actual verbs of actuation, whereas visualization does do that. But really, the types of experiences that one can architect with the information and all the capabilities that the building has are visualizations that then become actionable, similar to playing a game. So I think that what we'll find is that users of this advanced type of architecture will become virtuosos themselves in the real-time performance of space, the real-time performance of the spaces that they inhabit, and they can actually collaboratively jam together to make new things and make new experiences that are fresh for both of them or all of them, because they bring different capabilities to the table, they bring different models to the table, and they bring different instruments to the table that they're playing as they move through their life. Thank you very much.